Welcome to our bonus discussion on some early patristic thinkers. Each of these men navigated the challenge of what place does Athens have in Jerusalem? They wouldn't all come to the same conclusion. For some, Athens is subservient to Jerusalem. For some, Athens has nothing to do with Jerusalem. And for others, Athens and Jerusalem almost are the same thing. So we'll have a brief discussion on these handful of luminaries and discuss what they can contribute to our understanding not only of this period, but philosophy and life. As way of a bit of a bonus for those of you who want to know a little bit more about the philosophical contribution of other major patristics that we have not addressed in this class, we're going to have a brief overview of the life and one or two of the major ideas of some of these other significant patristics, such as Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Trotillion, Athanasius the Great, and the Cappadocian Fathers. Clement of Alexandria will be the first of these additional patristics that we are addressing. In many ways, we'll be able to draw some very clear similarities between Clement and the work and life of St. Irenaeus, as well as St. Justin Martyr. Clement was born around the year 150 in Athens and will die around the year 215. As an Athenian, he grew up surrounded by philosophy. He was familiar with and entrenched with Platonic and Aristotelian and Stoic thought. His parents were wealthy pagans. He did not grow up a Christian, and he'll spend most of his young life working with Greek philosophy. At some point in his life, he will encounter Christianity and become a Christian. He will even move on and become a bishop and relocate to one of those other major cities in the Roman world, Alexandria. Therefore, we'll refer to him generally as St. Clement of Alexandria. Clement sees philosophy as a direct operation of the divine logos. In many ways, he's drawing a parallel between Stoic thought and Christian thought. We will encounter with many Stoics that we need to honor the logos and respect the logos. For Clement, we are doing the same thing, but the logos is found within the second person of the Trinity, as explained already with the works of John the Evangelist. Clement will continue to emphasize the permanent importance of philosophy for the fullness of Christian knowledge. If you want to be truly Christian, you need to know logic and philosophy. In many ways, Clement anticipates the argument made by Abelard that true Christians are logicians, that you are using the logos to define everything. And again, while this becomes a central hallmark of the philosophy of Abelard, Clement is very much laying the groundwork for that philosophy here. Clement also says that the foundation of all gnosis, of all knowledge, is faith. Now, he's going to say that both gnosis, this privileged knowledge, and faith are given by Christ. Now, this is not the gnosis of the Gnostics that St. Irenaeus is addressing. He condemns that rather clearly in his life and his works. But he wants to show that there is knowledge in the philosophy of this world, that Athens can contribute to Jerusalem while he's in Alexandria. And he will often be seen as a comparison between Stoicism and Platonism, and drawing their notions of wisdom and applying it to Christianity. He praises Plato for setting forth the greatest possible likeness to God as the aim of our life. His portrait of the perfect Gnostic closely resembles that of the wise man as drawn by the Stoics. The true Gnostic, unlike Gnosticism, the true person who has this gnosis is a regular, ordinary, orthodox Christian, not one of those members of these radical, heretical sects that are dividing the physical world from the spiritual one. For Clement, faith involves a comprehensive knowledge of the essentials. Knowledge allows the believer to penetrate deeply into the understanding of what he believes. And this is the making perfect, the completion of faith. Faith of knowledge is what he's advocating for. And this is not conjecture, but rather he believes that you can have as a ground of your being knowledge, and this knowledge will serve as faith. We'll have the very strong connection between these ideas in the philosophy of Clement. In many ways, Origen is a continuation of the work in philosophy of Clement of Alexandria. He also was given many of the opportunities that Clement wasn't. Clement had his basis and foundation in philosophy. Origen, in many ways, learned this philosophy from Clement and others, but also had a basis in Christian life. He grew up in a Christian home, unlike Clement or Justin and others. As a teenager, he witnessed his father being martyred and desired to be martyred himself. His mother, fearing the loss of her son, hid his clothes so that way he'd have to run out of the house naked or near naked, and therefore shaming him from doing so and kept him from going and dying as a martyr. He will actually go on and die later as a martyr in the persecutions of the 250s, likely in Caesarea, although some will say in Tyre around 254. And there's a lot of questions about some of that, and most of the life of Origen is one that's a little clouded. Legends and other events will grow around him. We're not always sure if the writing or teaching is an idea that Origen is advancing or that of some of his students, who likely took his ideas even farther than he would have wanted to in many respects. In any way, though, it does get Origen condemned, and that is a problem. But also, to be honest, he is condemned posthumously. He's not tried or anything else like that, and it's his teachings that are explicitly condemned, largely because they go too far in one direction or another, or they imagine something or conceive of something as opposed to having it grounded in any of the major issues of faith. He was a fairly strict ascetic and a priest trying to serve his congregation. He was rather popular due to his notions of piety, and he was a prolific writer, somewhere around 2,000 different works, commentaries, and hundreds of sermons. And some of these are placing the estimates on how many he wrote as high as 6,000 different works. And again, this is a little tricky because a lot of people will add on to the actual Origen. He's a really tricky person to actually address because you don't always know if this is Origen or a student of Origen's. Now, what did he do? He spent so much time writing that he's been identified by many as the first theologian within Christianity, or at least the first systematic theologian, the first one to formulate theology in a systematic fashion. His writings can generally be divided into 4 classes: textual criticism, exegesis, systematic, practical, and apologetic theology, and his letters. And again, some of these are not always his. His most important writing was the Hexapla, a textual criticism that compared various translations of the Old Testament. And he's, again, using textual criticism very early on to try to understand what the meanings of words were. One of the key ideas of Origen that gets him condemned is an argument of universal restoration or universal salvation. This will be condemned over a century after his death at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. Origen believed that there would be an eternal return towards God, and that all creatures, all people, will unite themselves once again to God. Now, Origen's cosmology is one that really is a little different than the rest of Christianity, and the main reason why it can be condemned. For him, we all have a pre-eternal soul, and we all begin in rest with God. We all start off in union with God, but then through knowledge and learning, we move away from God, and this ends up resulting in the fall of us as individuals, and also our birth into our bodies. And again, we can see certain elements of Gnosticism and other ideas, Platonic thought as well, emerging in here. And then the thought is for Origen that this is a cycle that might return, that eventually we'll all move back closer to God the more that we learn. This was corrected by Maximus the Confessor, and Maximus uses the same discussion but changes the order of the movement and is seen as the correct way of interpreting this. For him, it starts with becoming, that God creates us, and then we have movement towards God, and ultimately the goal is theosis, or rest in God. Slightly different concepts, but overlapping here for the sake of Maximus the Confessor. And in fact, most of Maximus's philosophy and theology is serving as a correction to Origenism, if not the works of Origen explicitly. Interestingly enough, the next great philosopher within Christian history, the first one in the West in many ways, is Trotillion. Trotillion, born around 155 to 160 and will die in 225 in Carthage, is the first real theologian of note to write in Latin. And he helped establish Latin as one of those ecclesial languages. But unlike our other philosophers, Justin Martyr, Clement, or Origen, Trotillion saw no value in Greek philosophy. In fact, he thought philosophy was more closer to notions of sophism, but did value arguments of the law and reason in this respect. In some ways, we can see in Trotillion some of the same basic treatments of philosophy as his other North African counterpart, St. Augustine, although Trotillion will not end up dying in the church as Augustine did. Trotillion will convert to Christianity in 197 and spend a good amount of time writing rather vehemently against heretics. But within a decade, around 206, he'll join a group known as Montanists, a very strict moralist, heterodox to heretical group, but then break even from them in 213 because they were not strict enough for him. And he founded his own heterodox or heretical group known as the Trotillionists. And he will likely live out the rest of his life kind of in some form of obscurity as a rather strict moralist in North Africa. Now, there are some key ideas from Trotillion that will be important in the history of Christianity, namely that the church is an assembly of martyrs. But we also see the idea that while Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria will see the idea that to be a true Christian, you're going to understand philosophy, and true philosophy is inherently Christian. Trotillion said that the two didn't necessarily have anything to do with one another. That philosophy may be a useful tool in criticizing paganism and writing against Gnostics, but this wasn't what the heart of Christianity was, and therefore you don't need to be a philosopher to be a Christian. Now, it kind of didn't help Tritillion's case that at the end of his life he didn't die a Christian either, but this becomes one of his more important arguments, especially as it advances in the West. We're going to see a much closer connection between Christianity and philosophy in the East throughout this time, and less so in the West. In many ways, St. Athanasius the Great demonstrates the appropriate way of uniting reason with one's faith. He doesn't take it too far as Origen does, or reject the idea of philosophy within one's faith as Trotillion does. But much closer to Clement and Justin, he sees there's a union and a marriage of the two. Like Clement and Justin, St. Athanasius also grew up to pagan parents. He approached Christianity as something that he wanted to be a part of. He was born in either 296 or 298 in Alexandria, northern Egypt, and grew up amongst pagan parents. He was surrounded, though, at this point by Christians. Depending on the estimates, anywhere between a quarter and over half of the population of Alexandria at this point was likely Christian. And so Athanasius would have known a lot of Christians in the early 4th century. As an adolescent, he saw some of his schoolmates reenacting different church ceremonies, and he thought that this looked like fun. And Athanasius turned to them and said, "I'd like to do it too." And his schoolmates said, "You can't do this. You're not a Christian. This isn't something that you're playing with," even though they're reenacting it and playing with it. And Athanasius decided right then and there on the spot that he's a Christian from that point forward. Now, this might seem like a whim of an adolescent trying to say, "Fine, then I'm going to do it too." But he actually took this very seriously. And if you know anything too about conversion to Christianity, especially early on, this is a slow process. Well, he might declare himself a Christian. That meant he started going to church and catechisms and learning. This wasn't a simply like name it and claim it sort of moment in his life. And he took this new statement to be very serious for him. He will study and learn under the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Bishop Alexander. And Alexander will even predict that Athanasius would one day hold a great position. And indeed, he will succeed Alexander as the next bishop of Alexandria. As a young man, Athanasius will produce monumental works. Before he was even 20 years of age, he wrote a treatise entitled On the Incarnation, where he addressed the two natures of Christ as both fully man and fully God. Most of Athanasius's life was spent in a struggle with an ardent priest by the name of Arius. Arius had used philosophy in ways that didn't serve him very well. He argued that if the Father begat the Son, that the Son would therefore be something less than the Father. Therefore, Christ isn't truly God, but is something less. Athanasius did not like this idea one bit. In fact, he would argue with Arius and defeat Arius on numerous occasions. Athanasius argued that the Father's begetting of the Son, or the uttering of the Word, was an eternal relationship between them and not an event that took place within time. Therefore, Christ is of the same essence as the Father. Homoousis is the word that's used. Arius will get defeated in Alexandria, but appeal to more authority, even though his bishop has said he was wrong. And he ends up creating quite a stir. And eventually, Constantine, after converting the empire over to Christianity, wants this issue settled and will host a council in Nicaea in 325. This was important for Constantine as he wanted to make sure that this issue was resolved once and for all, and have his authority as well to end it. As such, he would invite bishops from all over the Christian world and their assistants. Alexander would go and launch the main attack against Arius, and Athanasius was there as well. While serving as a deacon, we would largely see him as assisting his bishop, although the Coptic Church maintains a tradition that Athanasius was in fact the main author of the Nicene Creed, and therefore has given him the title the Defender of the Faith. Others will call him the Father of Orthodoxy, as the person who maintains the orthodox or correct way of seeing things. And indeed, a unanimous vote supplies at the end, with a little bit of wrangling. A couple of people wanted some final points of negotiation and discussion about this, that indeed Athanasius and Alexander were correct with their assertion that the Son is of the same essence as the Father. Homoousis is the Greek term that's being used here. And Arius is rebuffed. Although this doesn't end Athanasius's battle with Arianism. Upon returning home from the council, Athanasius will become the next bishop on May 9th, 328, a few years later, and will hold this position for the next 45 years, 16 of which, though, were held in exile, as Arianism would end up becoming more fashionable in the city of Alexandria, and he was exiled as such about 5 to 7 different times, depending on what the governor of Alexandria liked and his particular moods and understanding. Thus there became an expression that came to be known in Alexandria, Athanasius contra mundus et mundum contra Athanasium, or while the world is set against Athanasius, Athanasius is equally set against the world. In many ways, this gave the bishop now, Athanasius, an opportunity to encounter more of what Christianity is than just what was there in the city. He'll spend some of his time with the Desert Fathers, including St. Anthony the Great, to whom he is the one who wrote the biography of him. This becomes the template for monasteries in both the East and the West. He is also the first to introduce the 40-day Lenten cycle in his Festal Letters number 12 around the year 337, and an Athanasian Creed, which is repeated oftentimes in the West, is accredited to him, but likely didn't come from him himself. Athanasius is also the one who composes the list of the 27 books for the New Testament. We saw some discussion of this with Marcion in the whole debate between Marcion and St. Irenaeus, but largely the list was more or less established by the time that we get to the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius kind of gives his weight and support behind the different collections of books that existed. Largely, there was already a set of lexicons that would have the general epistles and the epistles of Paul, as well as the Gospels. And in fact, more often than not, that's just how they were organized. And Athanasius is really the one who says, all right, this is the end of this list. The main debate, depending on where you were, would be how much more do you have in addition to these 27 books? Largely, they were all agreed. Athanasius said these are the books that we should have as the canon for the New Testament, and that is what they become. In many ways, it is fitting that the man who's called the Father of Orthodoxy is also the one who finally says, this is the book list, this is what it is. Even though they were written hundreds of years and passed around and known, it's finally now, after the Council of Nicaea, and with the authority of the Bishop of Alexandria, settled that this is the New Testament canon. In many ways, Athanasius embodies many of the principles that we saw within both Justin and St. Irenaeus. Like Justin, he was an apologist. He was engaged with debates of his day. He wrote letters of apology. He tried to show that his faith was something that's reasonable. Like St. Irenaeus, he was also a bishop. He also had practical concerns, and he had to address the errors that were around him. He will face persecution for this and be exiled on numerous occasions. But for Athanasius, philosophy, theology, reason was supreme. And
we needed to be reasonable with our acts of faith. We needed to be obedient to the truth when it was in front of us. And this required sacrifice and thanksgiving as well. This is one of the reasons why Athanasius is the patron saint of theologians, that he is revered as the father of orthodoxy, that his life and his works revealed a breadth of Christian experience in the early 4th century, and his steadfastness in maintaining this as well is also why he's regarded as a saint. Our final point of discussion will be a mention of the Cappadocian Fathers. Cappadocia, for those of you unfamiliar, is in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and this is a group of men who wrote profusely on issues of faith during their day. These three men include Basil the Great, 330 to 379, and his younger brother Gregory of Nyssa, 332 to 395, and Gregory of Nazianzus, 329 to 389. These three theologians sought to give Christianity a solid scholarly status on par with Greek philosophy of the time. They developed an intellectual rationale for Christianity's central goal, that of humanity's healing and loving union with God. Many times that other medieval philosophers are approaching works, they'll actually realize that the heart of these issues probably comes from one of these Cappadocian fathers. They had written so much on a breadth of issues. They expounded on the Trinity and the Incarnation, on the feasts that are celebrated, and how life should be lived. They are the principal source of philosophical speculation and knowledge for Eastern Christianity, while Augustine becomes that in the West. And given the length of time that we have, we're not really going to get into any of this, but I'd like to at least mention who they were and give you an opportunity to further research if indeed that is something you're interested in. Well, I hope you enjoyed this bonus. A brief mention of some of the early patristics and their contribution to philosophy, theology, and the shape of the church that will become foundational in our understanding of medieval philosophy, and of course that's role in modern philosophy as well. This different approach by Clement, Origen, Trotillion, Athanasius, and the Cappadocian Fathers of trying to make sense of the world around them from what they can observe and how they hold this with notions of Christian revelation as well.